Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch is the James and Wanda Lee Vaughn Professor of History, Dean of the Graduate School at Arkansas State University Jonesboro, and a 2021-2022 American Council on Education Lumina Fellow at the University of Central Arkansas. A native of Charleston, South Carolina, she received her BA and MA from the College of Charleston and a doctorate in history from the Ohio State University. Dr. Jones-Branch is the author of Crossing the Line, Women and Interracial Activism in South Carolina During and After World War II, and the co-editor of Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times. A second manuscript, Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas, 1913 through 1965, is now available from the University of Arkansas Press. Dr. Jones-Branch is currently working on a third book project titled To Make the Farm Bureau Stronger and Better for All the People, African Americans in the American Farm Bureau Federation, 1920 through 1966. She is additionally a U.S. Army Persian Gulf War veteran and a proud member of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated. I present to you Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch.
Good morning, and thank you all so very much. Let me start by sharing my PowerPoint presentation so you can see what I'm going to be talking about today. Can everyone see this? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much for having me here this morning. It's always an honor to talk before folks from all over Arkansas and to also be a commissioner on the Black History Commission of Arkansas. I'm especially thrilled to be here with such esteemed guests this morning. So this is indeed a great pleasure for me. I'm going to talk today about Black medical professionals in Arkansas between 1898 and 1950. I thought that I originally might want to talk for longer than that, and then I determined there's just so much history here that people are unaware of that we could be talking about this all day. So I knew I had to cut it off at some place. So let's hope the slides work. Here we go. So many think of African-American involvement. And let me also say this, I'm working with two laptops. So I've got my PowerPoint presentation on here, my notes on another laptop. So if I'm looking back and forth, that's what I'm doing. But many think of African-American involvement in the medical profession as a fairly recent phenomena, but nothing could be further from the truth. And this was particularly the case in Arkansas. And so today I'm going to take us back to the late 19th century and into the 1950s on an exploration that will chronicle the journey, the struggles, and successes of Black medical professionals in this state. So let us start here in 1898, when the Colored State Medical Association, founded in 1893, held its annual meeting in Little Rock. Such luminaries as Dr. D.B. Gaines, Reverend J.L. Watkins, and Professor J.C. Corbin, founder of Arkansas A.M.N. College, were among those who gave welcome addresses. The Daily Arkansas Gazette reported on the event saying, quote, "The delegates are well-dressed, intelligent-looking, and exceedingly credible representatives of their race." Hot Springs physician, Dr. C.M. Wade, responded to Black leaders' addresses with a, quote, "plea for the Negro doctor." He claimed that, quote, he deplored the conditions which demand such organizations separate and apart from the white organizations of the land. Yet I admire the manhood and courage which you as colored physicians evidence in meeting these demands. The demands placed upon Black physicians were many because they existed in a social context that denigrated African-American lives and morality. Indeed, when the Colored State Medical Association met in 1902, among the important topics discussed were, quote, "Is the Negro race deteriorating?" from Dr. J.W. Rowland from Pine Bluff. This was accompanied by such health discussions as, quote, "Can the morality of the colored race on big plantations be decreased?" And, quote, "What relationship should exist between dentists, pharmacists, and physicians?" In his address, C.M. Wade, the association president, further declared, "The Negro physician is especially called upon to play the part of the philanthropist. He must subjugate the possibility of accumulating great riches by instructing his patients in the art of keeping well. It is alarmingly true that our race is disintegrating physically. Consumption, which is pulmonary tuberculosis, scrofula, a type of tuberculosis infection, and venereal disease are claiming as its victims a greater percentage of this generation than in the past. Diseases are alarming in the context of morality produced and the inability of sanitary boards to arrest or circumscribe its ravage. It is our unquestionable duty as the advance guard of the Negro civilization to correct as far as possible these evils, to find the causes and produce the remedies that will in some measure retard these great diseases, which are devastating our communities and rushing our people into untimely graves. No people can survive against contending races who are not healthy, morally, religiously, and physically." End quote. Because African American medical professionals were the first and foremost concerned about health issues in Black communities, some traveled to areas where there was a great need for medical care among African Americans. And this is when they talk about the death rate among African Americans. In 1912, Dr. Lucretia Ann Carter from Helena became the first African American woman to apply for a medical license in Arkansas. Dr. Carter had studied medicine in Chicago. Of course, Black doctors were not welcome everywhere in Arkansas. In this article from the Star Progress from Berryville, Arkansas, also in 1912, she was advised to not locate in Berryville with any hope of making a living with her practice. So of course you couldn't go wherever you wanted to go. But Black doctors, however, thrived in other parts of the state. In 1919, for instance, Dr. John M. Gill, who practiced medicine in Brownsville and Memphis, Tennessee, set up an office in Pine Bluff. Dr. Gill also had a connection to Arkansas AM&N, then of course known as Branch Normal Institute, where he had been a lieutenant in the medical corps during World War I. When African American doctors, dentists, and pharmacists met in Little Rock in 1920, it was in part to offer a free medical and surgical clinic at the Fraternal and Bush hospitals. The J.E. Bush Memorial Hospital, known as one of the largest African American hospitals in the South, was founded by Black physicians in 1918 and named for John Edward Bush, an Arkansas Republican Party member and co-founder of the Mosaic Templars of America, who died in 1916. The Bush Hospital, which was located at Arch Street, was touted as the, quote, most magnificent Negro hospital in the South. Bush was also the official institution for African American employees of the Missouri and Pacific Rock Island Railways, because of course, African Americans did not expect to be treated as at white hospitals. And as you can also see in this example, Blacks could also go to the Royal Circle of Friends Hospital and the Fraternal Hospital. Now, about the Bush Hospital, newspapers noted the hospital's success just 2 to 3 years after it was established. In 1920, for instance, fiscal year 1920, per a report submitted to the hospital's directors and stockholders, 708 patients had been treated. The hospital, which had reportedly done, quote, splendid work among the colored people, end quote, also had a training school that included a standard curriculum. The hospital's superintendent was Dr. GW Stanley Ish, who was also a member of its surgical staff. And Ish, just a little more about him, was born in Little Rock in 1883 and was the child of educators. He graduated from high school in Little Rock and then attended Alabama's Talladega College, from which he graduated in 1903. He was then educated at Yale University's collegiate department, from which he graduated with a second bachelor's, although the field in which he earned the degree is unknown. Ish earned his medical degree from Harvard Medical School in 1909. He returned to Little Rock and helped found the J.E. Bush Memorial Hospital, which unfortunately closed in 1927. Ish was also a trustee and director of the United Friends Hospital Nurse Training School, founded in 1922 and chartered in 1924. In 1953, he was one of the four first Black doctors admitted to the Pulaski County Medical Society. The society's president, Dr. Raymond C. Cook, said that the four, quote, met all the personal qualifications and were thoroughly investigated by our credentials committee. One of the other four Black doctors, Dr. O.B. White, claimed that, quote, Arkansas has gone a step forward in race relations. Ish remained director of the United Friends Hospital until his death in 1970. Dr. Ish, along with his colleague, Dr. J.M. Robinson, also organized the Bush Memorial Hospital Benefit Association in 1921 to support the construction of a 300-bed facility with resources to care for tubercular patients. Dr. Robinson, who was also the organization's secretary-treasurer, and I just want to show you this very quickly. This is just a picture of Dr. Ish and his family in the Pittsburgh Courier back in 1964. Many of you know that this was a very well-known African-American newspaper, and it lists here Dr. Ish, his son, his daughters, his wife, the entire family is there. But anyway, Dr. J.M. Robinson, who was the organization's secretary-treasurer, was a graduate of Meharry Medical College, historically African-American Medical College in Tennessee. Like many educated African-Americans, his organizational affiliations were many. Robinson was, for instance, a member of the Negro Businessmen's League of Arkansas that was affiliated with the National Negro Businessmen's League, founded by Booker T. Washington in 1909. Robinson was additionally politically active. In 1942, he was the president of the Arkansas Negro Democratic Association and asserted that 10,000 qualified African Americans had voted Democratic since 1928. He further encouraged African Americans to vote when they were refused ballots by election officials in Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and Conway, Arkansas, who claimed that, quote, the election was for electors only. Robinson contributed to a plan to test the legality of refusing African Americans, citizens of the United States, the right to vote by submitting a report to NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall. Many of the struggles facing African American medical professionals were borne by African American women. Black nurses in particular were routinely denied access to training or medical opportunities to practice in their profession. Just as an example, in Little Rock in 1909, Pulaski County Judge Asher asserted to a grand jury that, quote, no nurses will be placed in the county hospital. He also opposed the use of white nurses or African American doctors in Black hospitals. However, Black nurses' services were necessary to combat the many illnesses plaguing African American communities like tuberculosis. That term comes up a lot. In 1914, Dr. GW Heyman, superintendent of the Little Rock Colored Infirmary, wrote to the Arkansas Gazette underscoring the need for the institution and Black nurses to improve health outcomes in African American communities. And this is what he said. The Negro race needs an institution of this kind, and one can well be operated if the proper efforts are rightly centered. Here in this adjoining city, Argenta, there are 20,000 Negroes, if not more, many of whom are in good circumstances, possessing a marked degree of intelligence. This institution has planned not only to offer the best attention to the injured and sick, but to train young colored women in the art of sick nursing, thereby enabling them to impart valuable health hints to thousands of their race who are daily violating the laws of good sanitation. The colored girls that are training in this infirmary will enter the homes of their race, acquaint themselves as to the manner and mode of their living, and thus be able to correct many of the evils that are making inroads upon their physical condition. Not only will the graduated nurses prove serviceable in this endeavor, but by reasons of her qualifications, avenues for useful employment will be opened, which will enable her to make an honest, upright living. In 1921, when the Pulaski County Tuberculosis Association gathered at the Marion Hotel, members embarked upon a $15,000 campaign to eradicate the disease among whites. African-American physicians, again, like Dr. GW Stanley Ish, were scheduled to address African-Americans the following Sunday. When African-Americans gathered in City Hall, J.E. Bush's wife was selected to, hold on just a second, was selected to chair the women's division, and attorney Scipio Africanus Jones chaired the men's division. Both divisions were tasked with the responsibility of, quote, canvassing business and professional men to aid in raising $15,000 required to carry on the work of the Pulaski Tuberculosis Association. Raising money, however, did not necessarily lead to equal resources. The association had one African-American nurse who was devoted, quote, full-time to the care of Negroes suffering from tuberculosis in Pulaski County. One nurse for all the African-Americans in Pulaski County. And although they also said an additional nurse is urgently needed in the work. Though few in number, Black nurses served in many capacities. African-American nurses got degrees diplomas rather, from the Bush Memorial Hospital Training School, as you can see in the example here from 1922. And what's good about digitized newspapers is that we can see who some of these women were. Black nurses served during international wars, like World War I. So this is where there was a recruiting station at 9th and Broadway, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're recruiting African-American women between the ages of 19 and 35 to enroll. We also have African-American nurses like Lena Jordan, who had been born in 1884 in rural Georgia. In 1911, she received her nursing certificate at the Charity Hospital in Savannah, after which she established a hospital in Cordell, Georgia, before moving to Arkansas in the 1920s. In 1927, she became head nurse at the Mosaic Temperance Hospital in Little Rock. Jordan founded the Arkansas Home and Hospital for Crippled Negro Children a short time later in 1932. The institution later moved to the home of the late J.E. Bush in 1942 and became a 20-bed general hospital for African Americans. Equipped for general surgery, medical, obstetric care, during World War II, the hospital provided prenatal care for the wives of Black servicemen who, again, could not expect to be treated at white hospitals. In one example in 1941, Dr. J.M. Robinson, assisted by Dr. Ish and nurses Ross and Jordan, performed a cesarean on a 44-year-old woman. Although the baby was stillborn, the team was able to save the mother's life, and according to the Black-owned and operated Arkansas State Press, only skillful surgery prevented the further loss of life in that of the mother suffering from complicated conditions in the pelvic region. In that quote, she would have died too had the doctors not operated immediately. The Lena Jordan Hospital also operated a nurse training program. According to the Pittsburgh Courier, under Mrs. Jordan's program, girls were brought from rural areas where they had no chance for an education and given work to do at the hospital while attending school. The girls additionally received clothing, room and board, and a small salary. After a 30-year career in Little Rock in 1950, Lena Jordan was honored on National Hospital Day for, quote, 40 years of service in the nursing field and contributions in helping members of her race. Jordan died in October of the same year. And this is just an example of the operation that she helped perform in 1944. An advertisement just to demonstrate how these their efforts were known far and wide. This is from a newspaper in Oklahoma City. And if you do a search for the Lena Jordan Hospital, you'll find ads like this about this hospital in newspapers all across the country, not just in the state. And of course, this is when she dies in 1950. She's so well known, once again, that her story, her labors, her successes make national African American newspapers. So I'd like to sort of end my talk by highlighting some other medical professionals. For example, like Dr. John Henry Smith. And to really underscore how nuanced and complicated these folks were. In 1909, Dr. John Henry Smith, a dentist, received a patent for creating a machine that extracted stones from clingstone peaches. Now, I just learned about this, literally had to look up clingstone peaches last night, but clingstone peaches, and you can see the example here in the corner, have flesh that cling tightly to the stone. And I've read that in some varieties, it's nearly impossible to remove the pits from the flesh. Now, just a little bit about Dr. Smith. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1854, studied dentistry in Chicago, and then moved to Little Rock. And I hope you're noticing a theme here where you have people who are moving from other parts of the country to practice in Little Rock. He also received patents for a pea sheller and a fruit parer. But again, African-American medical professionals are involved in all kinds of things in Arkansas. Dr. Smith was also a member of the Colored State Medical Association of Arkansas. And you've seen this before, but I want to point it out again that at their 1902 meeting, he with another doctor, again, gave a talk on what relationship should exist between dentists, pharmacists, and physicians. Smith was also an activist, artist, and a writer. He opposed the Separate Coach Act of 1891 that designated segregated transportation. Please note the date. This was a very long time before 1955. As I said, he was also a writer. In 1906, he published Model, a novel founded on facts gathered from living witnesses, which was about the relationship between George Monroe, a senator from Kentucky, and his enslaved paramour, Mary. Dr. Smith was also the father of Arkansas composer Florence Smith Price, about whom there will be a lecture on February 26th at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Smith died in 1910. When African-American dentists were excluded from professional organizations because of their race, and of course, here's an ad that's telling you more about Dr. J.H. Smith. When they were excluded from professional organizations because of their race, they formed their own, such as in this example in 1912, when they met at Dr. R.J. Meadows' home. And just to move a little bit beyond the time frame of my talk, this is an article about Dr. T.H. Keefe, a native of Darlington, South Carolina, again, another transplant to Arkansas, who had practiced in Blytheville, Arkansas since 1921. He, like many Black doctors, were deeply involved in the community. He was a member of the Harrison High School Athletic Association, the Parent Teacher Association, and as you can see here in this ad, he was honored as Man of the Year in 1952 by Omega Psi Phi fraternity. So in conclusion, what is patently demonstrable is that Black medical professionals have long been present in Arkansas. They were complex and nuanced human beings, as well as medical practitioners, and often key leaders in their communities and activists. Despite the racism they encountered, their perseverance reminds us that were it not for their struggles, medical access for African Americans would have been even more limited than it already was. Their example should also help us remember that their long-term struggles and their successes paved the way for the next generation of medical professionals, to include the esteemed Dr. Jocelyn Elders, with whom we are honored to have in our presence today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cherisse Jones, for awesome, awesome presentation. I just learned so much. It was like I'm soaking all this in, awesome information. I learned a lot. Like I stated earlier, if you have questions for Dr. Branch, I need you to put them in the chat so I can ask them of her. And I do have one question so far, and they want to know, the Bush Memorial Hospital closed not too long after being established. What contributed to its closure?
A lot of it has to do with lack of resources. A big part of it has to do with lack of resources. So even though the Black doctors were very well trained, and they did great work with African Americans, they never, ever, ever had the resources that the white hospitals had. And even when you embarked upon campaigns to get the community to contribute funds or whatever, you have to look at the populations you're dealing with. You're asking often for financial support from people who already don't have very much. And to the point that someone made earlier, Sybil Hampton, absolutely. It was one of the states in the South where they could be licensed. And Arkansas, again, and I've said this in other presentations, it was the place where a lot of Black people in the South could realize opportunities that they couldn't in other places. It's no accident that people from my home state, South Carolina, left and came to Arkansas. And in fact, and I'm going to keep saying this, a lot of Black people who think they've got long roots in Arkansas, go back a couple of generations, your people came from South Carolina, yes. Right? And certain kinds of names let me know that your people came from South Carolina. Case in point, Commissioner Elise Hampton, that's a very South Carolina last name. So people, this is part of a larger migration story as well. We tend to think about Black people moving to the north, but they also move west. And South Carolina, coming from South Carolina to Arkansas, is moving west. So they knew that they could realize opportunities here that might escape them in their home states. That's not to say that people didn't become physicians and so on and so forth back in South Carolina, but a lot of people felt like, perhaps I could struggle just a little bit less by going to Arkansas, where there seems to be more opportunity. And in more cases than not, they were right.
Any more questions? Okay, it says, have you done any research on Dr. Evangeline Upshur, the first African-American dentist in Arkansas? She was a graduate of Meharry.
I have not, but I have to tell you, I'm doing research on so many different things at one time. I have to remind myself that I have a full-time job as Dean of the Graduate School at Arkansas State University because I love doing this work so much. But I absolutely think that at some point, we need to do more about women doctors and women physicians in the state of Arkansas, because there are lots of stories there. And what did it mean not only to be a Black woman, but to be a Black woman physician, to also have to deal with racism and sexism at a certain point in our history. I don't know, Ms. Young, what happened to the invention for pitting peaches, but thank you for asking. And somebody said that canned peaches, those are the cling peaches. Yes, and they're great for making peach cobblers. I personally think the best part of peach cobbler is the crust. The crust, you can just put some peach flavoring on that and just keep the peaches. Yeah, and most people will fight you over the crust of peach cobbler. They're not fighting you over the peaches.
Right.
Thank you.
So, any more questions for Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch? If not, thank you again, Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch. As always, you do an outstanding job. So it's always a privilege when you agree to speak at one of these symposiums, because I know you will keep my attention, and I will always learn something new to educate somebody else.